Harold Winters lived behind walls, real walls, made of red brick and cold marble, and invisible ones, built of heartbreak, betrayal, and silence. At just 39, Harold was already one of Savannah's wealthiest men. He owned 6 companies, 3 private jets, and a mansion so large that even he hadn't stepped into every room, but none of it brought him peace. Not since the day his world had fallen apart, piece by painful piece. Outside, the Winters estate looked like a dream from another century, white columns standing tall like soldiers, a rattan gate that clicked closed with the precision of a prison door, and a vast garden that hadn't bloomed in years. Inside, though, the mansion felt like a museum for sorrow. The curtains stayed drawn, the chandeliers were never lit, the halls echoed with emptiness, not footsteps. Harold's life was a schedule, not a story. Wake up at 6 o'clock, drink black coffee alone, read the financial news without feeling, check every security camera feed, eat meals from a silver tray delivered by a faceless service, speak to no one, trust no one. He didn't start out this way. There had been a time when Harold laughed loudly, freely, like a man who had everything and still wanted to give more. That was back when Miriam was alive, his wife, his reason to believe in goodness. Miriam had filled this house with flowers, music, and the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls every Sunday morning. But cancer took her slowly, so slowly that Harold had time to break a little every day. And when she was gone, Harold didn't cry once. He didn't scream or fall apart. He simply stopped letting the world in. What came after was worse than death. First, it was his son Michael. At 22, the boy filed a lawsuit claiming Harold was mentally unfit, hoping to take control of the trust fund Miriam had created. Harold had raised that boy, held him through nightmares, paid for his private school, and even once donated a library. In his name, it meant nothing. Then his daughter, Ellie, she stole $100,000 from his personal bank account and vanished, leaving only a note that read, "I needed the money. Please don't try to find me." That single line hit Harold harder than Miriam's funeral. As if that weren't enough, the family doctor, a man Harold had trusted for 2 decades, was next. Dr. Martin Grayson had forged invoices and siphoned off tens of thousands of dollars over years, only to disappear the moment Harold discovered the truth. From that day on, Harold Winters didn't live like a man. He lived like a shadow, silent, guarded, watching, always watching. He replaced the household staff every few months. If someone asked even one personal question, they were gone. He upgraded the security system so often that his tech team privately called him the bunker man. He never smiled, never shook hands, never shared anything real, because in his mind, silence didn't lie, silence didn't betray. The only room untouched by time was the library. Miriam's library. She used to sit there in the mornings, sunlight dancing across her golden hair, a book always in her hand. Harold never read, but now he dusted every single shelf with his own hands. He cleaned her chair like it was sacred. He wouldn't let anyone enter that room, not even the security team. And yet, something was changing. Slowly, quietly. Harold felt it in the way he stared out the window longer. These days, in the way his heart tugged when he heard the sound of children playing beyond his gates. In the way he sat in the library and whispered to the air, "I miss you." He didn't want to feel anything. Not again. Feeling made people weak, vulnerable. And Harold had promised himself he would never be either of those again. But life doesn't care about promises made to pain. The decision one rainy morning, Harold's body betrayed him. His knees ached, his vision blurred. The stress of running multiple businesses, reviewing surveillance tapes, and living in paranoia had taken its toll. He leaned against the marble counter in the kitchen, breath short, and realized something. He needed help. Just enough to clean the house. Just enough to make sure the dust didn't bury him along with his memories. Not companionship, not conversation. Just function. He called a staffing agency in Atlanta, one that catered to high-end, high-security clients. The operator, a woman named Denise, tried to sound cheerful. "Of course, Mr. Winters. But I must tell you your requirements are ... unusual. I'm not looking for company. Just silence," Harold said. "No criminal record, no social media, no personal questions, no wandering into restricted rooms, minimal speaking unless spoken to, no guests ever." Denise hesitated. "Understood, sir. I'll send you a short..." He received 3 profiles. The first 2 were too polished, too smiley. One of them had over 50,000 Instagram followers. Harold deleted them instantly. The third was plain. Name, Jada Harris, age 27, previous roles, live-in housekeeper, senior caregiver, part-time librarian. Note at the bottom, driven by purpose, not profit. Harold almost laughed. Purpose was for fools, but the simplicity caught his attention. No frills, no filters, no drama. He clicked schedule interview. The first glimpse Tuesday morning through the security monitor. Harold saw her for the first time. Jada stepped off a city bus across the street from the gate. No car, no driver, just a sturdy gray coat and a soft scarf around her curls. She walked with quiet confidence, neither slow nor hurried, neither timid nor arrogant, like someone who had learned to move carefully through life but still held her head up high. She reached the intercom. She didn't press the button twice. She pressed it once, then waited. Harold unlocked the gate. He met her at the door, not out of politeness but curiosity. She was younger than he expected, but her eyes looked older, wiser, eyes that had seen more than they should have at her age. "Miss Harris," he greeted, voice flat. "Mr. Winters," she replied, gently bowing her head. He led her inside without small talk. The house was cold, the silence thick. They sat opposite each other in the grand but lifeless living room. Before he could speak, she asked calmly, "Mr. Winters, I'd like to confirm something. In the job description, it says the library is off limits, unless cleaning. Do you want me to dust the shelves only, or rearrange books by height for neatness?" Harold blinked. No one had ever asked that. Most people asked about salary. She asked about respecting sacred space. "Just dust," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Don't move a single book." Jada nodded and scribbled something into her small notepad. She didn't fake a smile. She didn't compliment the house. She asked about cleaning protocols, the chemical types he preferred, and whether she should bring her own gloves. In 17 minutes. The interview ended. He watched her walk back down the gravel path through the window. She didn't glance back, just walked steady and quiet, as if she belonged to another time. The storm inside that night. Harold didn't sleep. He paced the hallway, staring at camera feeds. Something about Jada had unsettled him, not in a dangerous way, in a different way, a way he didn't know how to describe. He poured himself a scotch, sat in the surveillance room, and whispered to the empty screen, "What if she's different?" Then he heard another voice inside him, the one built from betrayal, from bitterness. It snarled back, "They always seem different, until they're not." So Harold made a decision, one he had made before with others, a test. He would leave the safe door open. Inside, millions, cash, jewelry, gold coins, irreplaceable family heirlooms. And right beside the safe, he'd place a folded slip of paper with the code liberally carelessly like an invitation. "Let's see what happens when no one is watching." But this time, Harold would be watching. Every second. The following morning dawned gray and cold, with mist clinging to the iron gates of the Winters estate, like secrets too afraid to speak. Harold Winters sat alone in the surveillance room, eyes locked on the dozens of camera feeds flickering silently. Across the wall, every corner of the house was visible to him. The living room, the kitchen, the corridors, even the small hallway that led to the most dangerous room of all, his private vault. The plan was simple. Harold had used this same method before. It always exposed the truth. He would leave the vault door slightly open, not wide, just enough for someone to notice. He would lay out the temptation clearly. Neat stacks of $100 bills, velvet boxes of diamonds, a sapphire brooch once worn by Miriam during their first gala. Right beside the open vault, he placed a single slip of paper on a side table. Written on it, in neat black ink, was the 6-digit code, 6 numbers that could unlock the rest of the fortune with a single press of a finger. He arranged everything to appear like a careless mistake, an accident by a distracted, perhaps forgetful man. But Harold was never careless. This was the final part of his hiring ritual, the one he never told anyone about. It wasn't just about finding a housekeeper. It was about finding a soul who could resist what most couldn't. At 7:52 a.m., the buzzer rang. Jada Harris had arrived. Through the monitor, Harold watched her as she stepped through the gate with the same calm poise she'd shown during the interview. She wore a simple dark coat again, and her hair was tucked beneath the same soft scarf. No flashy purse, no jewelry. Her clothes were clean but humble, her steps neither eager nor hesitant, just steady, like a person who knew how to stand in storms without flinching. She paused for a moment near the roses, barely, blooming along the front walkway. She reached down, picked up a broken petal from the gravel, and gently placed it beside the bush before continuing to the door. Harold noted that detail. He didn't know why, but he did. The door unlocked for her automatically. Jada entered quietly, greeting the empty hallway with a respectful silence. She didn't shout hello, she didn't call for him, she simply began her work. In the surveillance room, Harold leaned forward in his chair, watching closely. This was the beginning. For the first hour, Jada cleaned the entranceway, living room, and main hallway with focused precision. She carried her small cleaning kit from room to room, dusting corners, wiping surfaces, and placing small things back exactly where they belonged. She never lingered, never glanced into rooms she wasn't assigned to, never checked drawers or opened doors. She moved with the quiet grace of someone used to being invisible. Harold watched her eyes more than anything. Eyes tell stories, he believed, but hers remained calm, steady, unreadable. When she entered the grand hallway that led to the east wing where the safe room waited, Harold tensed. He set down his coffee and turned off the sound. This was it. Jada walked slowly down the marble hall, her soft shoes making almost no sound on the polished floor. At the end of the corridor, the vault door was slightly ajar, its heavy metal edges catching the morning light. The slip of paper with the code rested neatly on the side table like bait in a trap. Jada stopped. She looked at the vault. She didn't step forward for a long time. She simply stood there, her hand still by her side, her eyes fixed on the door that no one should ever see open. In the surveillance room, Harold held his breath. Then, Slowly, Jada took one cautious step closer. Her expression changed not with greed, but with confusion. She looked down and noticed the slip of paper. Her brow furrowed. She didn't reach for it. She didn't pocket it. Instead, she pulled out her phone. Harold zoomed in on the camera. To watch her lips, "I need to report something," she said softly into the phone. "The safe door is open, and I found a paper with the code. I don't know if this was intentional, but I didn't want to touch anything without permission." She ended the call and took one step back. For several moments she just stood there, not panicked, not tempted, just alert, responsible. Harold leaned back in his chair, stunned. In all the years he'd used this test, no one, not a single one, had ever reported the vault without stepping inside first. Not until now, and yet, he didn't celebrate because temptation has many faces. Sometimes it comes quietly after the first storm. The camera showed Jada moving away from the vault and back into the hallway. But Harold noticed something change. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed it against the wall. Then, her phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen and her face shifted, her lips parted, her eyes filled with something Harold hadn't seen, yet not fear, pain. Jada answered the call. "Mom," she said softly. "What's wrong?" Harold couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but he watched Jada's expression collapse into a mixture of helplessness and urgency. Her voice trembled. "What do you mean, the bank's shutting down the store this week?" She turned her back to the camera and pressed her free hand to her face. "But that's Daddy's store. That's all we have left. 38,000. How could it happen so fast?" Harold sat forward. Every inch of his instincts told him this was the real moment. Not the open vault, not the money, but this, the test of life when need screams louder than morals. Jada ended the call. She stood frozen in the hallway, looking back toward the vault. The camera captured every heartbeat on her face. Her jaw clenched. Her hands shook. She took one step forward. Harold's chest tightened. She stood at the door now, fully facing it. The money glistened inside. Bundles of cash, jewelry boxes, enough to save her family's store, and much more. Her gaze dropped to the slip of paper, just 6 numbers. Her hand hovered, then clenched into a fist. She whispered something. The camera couldn't catch it, but Harold read her lips. "No." She reached down, picked up the slip, and entered a random code. The vault beeped. The door clicked shut. She locked it herself. Then, in one motion, she folded the slip, placed it deep into her pocket, and sank to the chair beside the hallway wall. She covered her face with both hands and sobbed in the surveillance room. Harold felt something inside him begin to crack. Not a break, not yet, but the first small fracture in a wall he had spent years building. She didn't take anything. She didn't even touch anything. And yet, he had nearly expected her to fail because he believed everyone did, but Jada hadn't, not when she had the chance, not even when she had the need. Time passed slowly after that. Jada didn't move for nearly 30 minutes. She simply sat in that chair, wiping her tears and whispering something to herself again and again. Harold couldn't read her lips this time, but her expression was clear. Regret without guilt, sadness without shame. She had made a choice, one that cost her dearly. But she didn't waver. Harold watched in silence, unmoving, his coffee cold on the table. Somewhere deep in his soul, he felt Miriam's voice whisper to him through memory. "Not everyone is the enemy, Harold. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who could take everything, but choose not to." He hadn't thought of Miriam's voice in years. At exactly 5:55 p.m., Harold stood. He left the surveillance room, climbed the stairs, and walked down the marble hallway where Jada still sat. He made his footsteps louder than usual when she heard him. She stood quickly, straightening her coat, her eyes red but clear. Harold stopped in front of her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice softer than he'd used in years, he asked, "Miss Harris, you're still here?" Jada nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir. I didn't want to leave until you came back. I wanted to make sure everything stayed safe." Harold looked at her, really looked at her, not like a potential thief, not like an employee, but like a person who had just passed a test that no one was ever meant to pass. "I know," he said quietly. She blinked in confusion. "You know." He nodded. "I saw everything." The moment Harold said the words, "I saw everything," Jada felt something heavy shift inside her. Her spine straightened, her jaw tightened, and though she tried to maintain her composure, her body betrayed her. Her breath caught for just a second. A silence settled between them, thick like the humid Georgia air before a summer storm. The wide marble hallway that had once felt so empty now pulsed with a kind of invisible electricity. She stared at the man before her, trying to understand what kind of person would stage a test like this, and why. Harold didn't raise his voice. In fact, he spoke gently, almost too gently for a man who had once been known for commanding boardrooms, for shaking the hands of governors and CEOs, for silencing rooms with nothing more than his stare. But today, in front of Jada, he was just a man, a flawed man who had placed a temptation in front of her like a trap hand, now stood face to face with the only person who hadn't taken the bait. "I watched you," Harold said again, his voice low. "From the moment you entered this house this morning. I watched you walk past the safe. I watched you look at the money. I saw your call. I saw your tears. I saw what you could have done, but didn't. Jada didn't move. She didn't speak. Her fingers twitched slightly at her side, as if fighting the urge to cross her arms in self-defense, or to walk away entirely. Harold sighed and looked down at the cold floor. It was a test. A terrible one, I know. One I've given to many times before. But no one's ever passed it. Not like you did. The confession hung in the air. Jada's voice finally broke through. Soft but strong. So you set me up. Harold flinched. Not visibly, but inside. He felt it. Yes, I did. Her eyes searched his. Not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. I came here to work, she said quietly, not to be watched like a criminal. Harold nodded slowly. I know, and I'm sorry. I've lived a long time, surrounded by betrayal. My son, my daughter, even my doctor. They all used me. I stopped trusting people a long time ago. And I suppose I thought anyone who came into this house would do the same. Jada's eyes softened a little, but she didn't look away. Mr. Winters, everyone carries their own pain, but pain doesn't give you the right to judge others before they've done anything wrong. Her words struck deeper than she knew. Harold had once been a man with armies of employees and admirers, but all it had taken was a few knives in the back for him to close every door and lock every vault nut, just the ones with money but the one around his own heart. And yet, here was this young woman who had seen temptation laid bare and chose to turn away, not just because of rules, not out of fear, but because of principle, because of who she was when no one was looking. Harold reached into the inside pocket of his coat. From it, he withdrew a small white envelope. This is for you, he said, holding it out. Inside is a check for $50,000. Jada didn't take it instead. She stared at the envelope like it was poison. I don't want it, she said. Harold's brows lifted. Why not? You earned it. No, she replied, shaking her head slowly. That's the point. I didn't do anything special. I just did what's right. Taking this money would make it feel like I only made the right choice because I wanted a reward, and that's not who I am. For the second time in one day, Harold was speechless. He held the envelope in his hand, but his fingers slowly closed around it again. He tucked it back into his jacket. You're not like anyone I've ever met. There was a long pause between them. Then Jada said something he didn't expect. Do you remember 5 years ago? She asked when the St. Luke's Children's Hospital launched a public campaign for emergency surgery funding. Harold blinked. Yes, I donated anonymously to a few surgeries there. Why? One of those surgeries saved my cousin's life, she said, her voice suddenly trembling. He was 9 years old, born with a heart defect. The surgery cost more than our family could afford. My parents were breaking down. We didn't know what to do. Then one day, the hospital told us a donor had covered the full cost. They never said who, but I found your name on the donor list. I knew it was you. Harold's heart stopped for a second. He remembered the boy, not his face, but the file, the medical records, the urgency. He had written the check and moved on. But for Jada, it was everything. I didn't apply for this job to get anything from you, she said. I didn't even plan to tell you. I just wanted to work in the home of the man who saved my cousin to give back in some small way. Harold sat down heavily on the edge of a nearby bench. This wasn't just a test anymore. This was fate. The woman he had tested was the very soul his kindness had once saved, and now she had returned, not to take from him, but to guard him. I don't deserve your loyalty, he said finally, staring at the marble floor. I don't even deserve your presence in this house. Jada stepped forward. No, she said gently. You deserve to be reminded that not everyone in this world is out to hurt you, that good people still exist. You've spent so much time protecting your heart that you forgot how to use it. Harold didn't look up, but he nodded slowly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Jada reached into her own coat pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper with the vault code. Here, she said, holding it out to him. I believe this belongs to you. He took it, not because he needed it, but because something about that small, simple gesture shattered the last bit of the cold armor around him. Later that evening, as the sky turned to deep indigo and the stars began to pierce through the darkness, Harold found himself sitting in the library for the first time in weeks. The lights were off. Only the soft amber glow of Miriam's favorite lamp lit the room. And across from him, Jada sat with a cup of tea, flipping through one of the older books on the shelf, one Miriam had loved. Harold watched her in silence for a while, then finally said, I've been alone a long time, Miss Harris, but today, it didn't feel that way. Jada looked up, her smile quiet but real. Neither did it for me, she replied. That night, for the first time in years, Harold didn't check the cameras before going to sleep. He didn't lock the safe. He didn't double-bolt the door. He simply turned off the lights, lay down, and let the silence become peaceful again, not because he trusted the world, but because he trusted her. The next morning, golden sunlight spilled over the grand estate like a soft veil, cutting through the shadows that had clung to Harold's home for years. For once, the curtains were drawn open. A light breeze floated through the hallway windows, gently rustling the heavy drapes. The mansion once a fortress of silence, now breathed with a strange new energy of feeling that something was changing. Harold Winters woke early, not from habit, but from something else. Restlessness, perhaps, or something warmer. As he moved through the house, his steps lacked their usual rigidity. His face wasn't as sharp. He wasn't thinking about security feeds or contracts or betrayals. He was thinking about Jada Harris, the young woman who had locked his vault and opened his heart in the span of a single day. She arrived promptly at 8 a.m., as she always had. There was no difference in the way she carried herself, still calm, still steady, but Harold could see it now. Strength. Not just the quiet discipline of a good worker, but the deep, grounded strength of someone who had faced storms and stayed upright. He invited her into the library. This time, there was no surveillance, no traps, no hidden motives. Just Harold, seated by the fireplace, and Jada standing by the bookshelf with a cloth in one hand and hesitation in her eyes. He gestured for her to sit. She did, cautiously. The air between them was different, now less formal, more human. "Miss Harris," Harold began, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I've spent years surrounded by walls. Not just these," he gestured around the towering shelves and marble pillars, "but walls I built in my mind. I thought they'd protect me from pain. Instead, they protected me from life." Jada looked at him, unsure where this was going, leaned forward slightly, reaching into his jacket again. "I offered you this yesterday." He placed the same white envelope on the table between them. $50,000. A thank you. A reward. A debt repaid. You refused. "I still do," Jada said, without hesitation, her tone respectful but firm. Harold raised an eyebrow, surprised again, though by now he should have known not to underestimate her. "Why?" he asked simply. Jada looked down at the envelope, then met his gaze with unwavering calm. "Because my values don't change based on the price of a check. You helped my cousin years ago. You saved his life. I came here because I wanted to repay that act, not to be bought." Harold sat back in his chair, quiet for a long time. Then he smiled genuinely, not the forced hollow curve of his lips he'd practiced for the public, but a smile that lit something in his eyes. "You know, people don't surprise me anymore," he said. "But you did." Jada smiled politely, but said nothing. She didn't want praise. She didn't need validation. She had done what was right. That was enough. Harold stood up and walked to the tall cabinet beside the fireplace. From it he pulled a leather-bound folder, aged, worn, but well cared for. He returned to the table, placed it beside the envelope, and gently slid it toward her. "This," he said, "is the Winters Charity Foundation. My wife Miriam started it with me before she passed. For years I ran it alone, quietly, anonymously. But I could never grow it the way I wanted. I didn't trust anyone enough to take it further." Jada's eyes widened. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand." Harold nodded. "I want you to lead it." The room fell silent. Jada blinked, stunned. "Me?" "Yes," Harold said firmly. "You?" She shook her head slowly, stunned by the weight of what was being asked. "Mr. Winters, I'm just a housekeeper. I don't have experience with foundations or managing large funds. I don't even have a business degree." "But you have what no one else does," Harold replied. "You have integrity. You have heart, and I've watched you, Miss Harris. You're methodical. You ask questions before you act. You don't assume. You don't rush. That's leadership. The rest, I can teach you." Jada sat frozen, the folder untouched before her for a moment. All the confidence she had built in herself felt like it was crumbling under the pressure of expectation. Her mind raced with questions. How could I lead a foundation? How could I but be responsible for others? What if I fail? What if I disappoint him? Harold saw it in her eyes. "I'm not asking you to do this alone," he said gently. "I will be here every step of the way. This foundation has been my heart for years, but I wanted to have new life, a new voice, one that understands the pain and hope of people, one that knows struggle. And you, Jada, you are that voice." She looked at him, trying to measure the truth in his words, and found it raw, unfiltered, and full of trust. A trust she had never been given in her life, especially not like this. Still, she hesitated. "What if I fail?" Harold leaned in, slightly, his gaze intense but kind. "Then we fail together. But I would rather fail trying with you than succeed with someone I can't trust." Tears welled in Jada's eyes, uninvited but unstoppable. All her life, she had worked hard, silently, diligently, without asking for much. She had helped others, she had made sacrifices, but never had anyone looked at her like this. Never had anyone said, "I trust you." She reached out and touched the folder, her fingertips trembling slightly on the leather surface. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered. "You don't need to be ready," Harold said. "You just need to be willing." Jada closed her eyes for a moment, breathed in deeply, then nodded. "I'll try," she said softly. "I'll give it everything I have." Harold nodded with quiet satisfaction. "That's all I ask." Later that night, Jada sat in the guest room Harold had offered her to use during long workdays. The folder lay open on her lap, filled with names, numbers, proposal drafts, and reports. It felt overwhelming. The responsibility, the scale, the reach. But buried beneath that weight was something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. And somewhere, Across the hall, in the library, Harold sat at Miriam's old desk, smiling for no one but himself. He didn't check the cameras. He didn't lock his study. He didn't retreat into silence. Instead, he whispered to the bookshelves around him. She said no to the money, Miriam, just like you would have. For the first time in years, he felt like his wife might be proud of him again. And for the first time in her life, Jada Harris realized that the reward she had refused had given her something far more valuable, meaning, and a chance to change the world. The days that followed felt like waking up in a new version of the world. For both Harold Winters and Jada Harris, the routines that once defined their lives began to dissolve, making way for something unfamiliar but deeply necessary: growth. The Winters estate, once entombed in silence and suspicion, began to stir with the quiet energy of renewal. Sunlight filtered through clean windows. The scent of coffee and fresh papers filled the old library each morning. Laughter didn't echo through the halls just yet, but hope did. Jada, for the first time in her life, found herself seated at a desk once reserved for lawyers and executives. Each morning she sat in the sun-washed study adjacent to Harold's library, poring over documents, spreadsheets, community proposals, and records from the Winters Charity Foundation. Her fingers trembled the first few days as she read through six-figure budgets and complex project outlines. At night, she reread everything again, scribbling questions in the margins, creating post-it trails across her walls like tiny beacons of curiosity. She was determined to learn, not to impress but to deserve the trust that had been placed in her hands. Harold watched her from afar with growing admiration. At first, he guided her gently, explaining terms, introducing her to his accountant, and encouraging her to challenge every assumption. But he didn't spoon-feed her. He respected her intelligence enough to let her struggle, and she did, but with grit and dignity. On the fourth day, she stayed up until 3 a.m. drafting a proposal for a mobile health van in a rural Georgia town. When Harold saw the proposal the next morning, he paused halfway through, leaned back in his chair, and whispered under his breath, "Miriam would have loved this." He never said that out loud to Jada, not yet. Some things still hurt, too much. By the second week, Jada had a rhythm. Mornings were for correspondence responding to inquiries from small organizations, local families, and medical clinics across the South who had once given up hope of receiving funding. Afternoons were for research, budget reviews, and learning the laws that governed nonprofit funding. Evenings were her favorite, when Harold would sit across from her in the library, sometimes with coffee, sometimes in silence, and share stories from the foundation's earliest days of children with no shoes, elderly veterans who hadn't seen a doctor in years, and community centers built on land no one else cared about. But even in the midst of this beautiful rebirth, neither of them could ignore the cloud that still hovered on the horizon: Harold's past. More specifically, his son, Michael. The first mention came as a letter. It arrived one morning in a sleek black envelope with a wax seal that Jada found unusual, almost theatrical. She placed it on Harold's desk without opening it, not out of fear, but respect. When Harold saw the handwriting, his face tightened. He didn't need to read it. He already knew. Michael had heard about Jada, about the changes in the foundation, about the money, and about his father finally letting someone in. Harold read the letter that evening in private. His son's words were polished, legally phrased, and dripping with contempt barely hidden beneath civility. Michael was demanding a full audit of the Winters Foundation. He claimed concern over Harold's mental faculties and the influence of an unfamiliar individual on his financial decisions. In short, he wanted control. Again, Harold didn't tell Jada right away. He wanted to protect her, but she wasn't someone who liked to be protected from the truth. She found out 3 days later when the media called the first article was online. Then came the calls from reporters, one from a local Savannah newspaper, and 2 from national blogs that feasted on family drama among the rich. The headlines were brutal: reclusive millionaire allegedly manipulated by Maid, Winters' legacy in jeopardy. Son calls for investigation. Jada sat in the library that morning, staring at the screen of Harold's office computer, reading the headline again and again, her stomach twisting. She felt betrayed not by Harold, but by the idea that the world would reduce her integrity to nothing more than a whisper of scandal. They didn't care about the truth. They didn't care that she'd turned down money, locked a vault, or stayed late every night to help strangers she'd never meet. They only cared that she had come from nothing and that a man like Harold had dared to believe in her. When Harold entered the room, she stood up quickly, the headline still glowing behind her. "You should have told me," she said, not accusing, just hurt. Harold's face dropped. He crossed the room slowly, sat down, and sighed. "I know. I just didn't want to burden you. I thought if I kept it quiet, it might pass." Jada shook her head. "Things like this don't pass, Mr. Winters. They grow in the dark. And now, the world thinks I manipulated you. That this," she gestured to the folders, to the foundation plans, to everything they had built, as some kind of scam. He looked at her then deeply. His eyes were tired but fierce. "I don't care what they think," he said. "I care what you think. And I trust you, Jada. That hasn't changed." Her voice trembled. but I care what they think, because if they believe this story, then all the people who need our help might never get it. Harold leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his silvering hair. Then we tell them the truth, not just in words, in actions. We'll show them who you really are. That evening they called a press conference. That it was a bold move, risky, but Jada agreed. She stood before reporters, cameras, and flashing lights, dressed not in expensive suits, but in a simple navy blouse and slacks. She didn't wear makeup. She didn't have a PR team. All she had were the truth, the foundation records, and Harold seated quietly behind her as a symbol of his unwavering belief. Jada spoke slowly, carefully, but firmly. I know what some of you think, she began. That I'm just a housekeeper who got lucky. That I took advantage of a kind but lonely man. That I don't belong here. She paused, letting the silence stretch. I am a housekeeper, and I'm proud of that. I worked for years in homes, hospitals, and shelters. I cleaned floors and changed bedpans. And through that work I met people whose stories would break your heart. She reached for a folder, opened it, and held up one of the project plans, a community kitchen that had already begun construction in a low-income neighborhood. This is what I do now. With Mr. Winter's trust, I help people who are just like my family, hard-working, hopeful, but drowning. If you want to investigate me, go ahead. You'll find no secrets, no luxury cars, no hidden bank accounts, just long nights, small victories, and a whole lot of heart. Harold stood and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She's the best decision I've ever made, he said simply, and I stand by her, completely. The room went quiet. The reporters didn't know what to say. They weren't used to honesty delivered without fanfare, just truth, plain and steady. The days after the press conference were tense. More articles came, some kind, some skeptical, but people were watching, and slowly, support started trickling in. Letters from families who had received help through the foundation, handwritten notes from retired veterans, donations with attached messages that said things like, "We believe in you, and thank you for standing tall." Michael didn't stop. His legal team escalated. There would be court proceedings, there would be depositions, there would be noise, but for Jada and Harold, the mission didn't pause. They worked harder. They launched 3 new projects in the next month. They hired a legal team, 2 this time, not just to defend themselves, but to protect the work they had built. And every night, after the world had thrown its worst at them, they returned to the library, sat across from each other, spoke not of strategy or lawsuits, but of hope, of the people they had helped, of the girl who received a laptop, of the elderly man who now had a roof over his head, of the mother who sent pictures of her child's first day in a wheelchair bought with a foundation grant. Those were the voices they cared about. That was the foundation of trust, not just between a man and a woman, but between pain and healing, between yesterday's wounds and tomorrow's promises. The courtroom was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the back, whispering and murmuring as cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes. At the front, seated with a quiet dignity, were Harold Winters and Jada Harris, 2 people who, just months earlier, had been strangers walking alone through the wreckage of their own pasts. Now, they sat side by side as co-defendants in a lawsuit that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. Harold's son, Michael Winters, stood on the opposing side of the room, flanked by a phalanx of high-powered attorneys dressed in custom suits and arrogance. His jaw was tight, his eyes hollow, his expression a carefully constructed wall of entitlement and ambition. For Harold, it felt like betrayal all over again, but sharper this time, more bitter, because he had already survived the loss of love, the sting of deception, and the collapse of trust. But this was his own flesh and blood, dragging him into court in front of the entire country, not to protect him but to take from him control, legacy, power, and worst of all, dignity. Michael's legal claim was simple on the surface but cruel. At its core, he alleged that Harold, now nearing 40 but mentally compromised, had been manipulated by Jada Harris, a former maid, into transferring decision-making authority over the Winters Charity Foundation. Michael argued that this transition was reckless, fraudulent, and in violation of fiduciary responsibility. But beneath the legal jargon, everyone in the room knew what it really was. Son furious that he no longer had the key to his father's fortune. A man who never understood what wealth was truly meant for. As the judge entered and proceedings began, Harold kept his eyes on the mahogany desk before him. His hands were folded neatly, but Jada could see the slightest tremble in his fingers. She leaned close, her voice barely a whisper, and said, "No matter what happens today, thank you for trusting me." Harold didn't speak, but his head turned slightly toward her, and his eyes, those sharp, guarded, world-weary eyes, shone with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered back. The hearing began with Michael's lawyer, a tall, sharp-tongued man, who seemed to relish the opportunity to tear lives apart under the pretense of logic. He painted Jada as a low-level domestic worker who manipulated an aging, emotionally vulnerable man into handing her control of a multi-million non-profit. He presented fragments of surveillance footage taken out of context, showing Jada alone in hallways, staring at papers, closing doors. He read portions of bank statements, made vague accusations, questioned her qualifications, and tried to drown her in innuendo. The crowd watched in silence as the prosecution pressed on, cold and calculated. Then came Jada's turn. She rose from her seat slowly, her spine straight, her gaze unshaken, dressed simply, just like at the press conference. She walked to the witness stand and took her oath. The courtroom held its breath. She looked directly at the judge, not flinching, and began to speak not like a defendant, but like a woman who had carried burdens all her life and refused to be broken by one more. "I'm not here to defend myself," she said. "I'm here to defend the truth that no one should be ashamed of. That character is not measured by where you come from, but by what you choose to do when no one's watching." She told the full story. The open vault, the slip of paper with the code, the phone call from her mother, the moment she stared at a room filled with enough money to solve her family's problems forever, and turned away. She explained, not with drama, but with quiet power, how she had taken a job to repay a silent debt from years before, surgery paid for by an anonymous donor who turned out to be the very man now sitting beside her in court. She spoke of sleepless nights learning how to manage non-profit budgets, of responding to desperate letters from struggling communities, of sitting in the library each evening beside Harold, not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand the heart behind the numbers. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge looked thoughtful. Even the stenographer paused, seemingly stunned by the depth of what she had just heard. Michael's lawyer attempted to rattle her, to pick apart her words with cold logic. But Jada never wavered. Every answer she gave was rooted in calm, consistent honesty. She didn't defend herself like someone on trial. She answered like someone who had already lived her truth and didn't need to prove it to anyone. Then Harold stood. Despite his age, despite the stress, he walked slowly and steadily to the witness stand. The courtroom leaned in as he placed one hand on the wood, eyes scanning the room until they landed on his son. "I admit," Harold began, "that I lived in suspicion for many years. I trusted no one. I lost my wife. I was betrayed by my children. I spent years behind walls, watching people through cameras instead of looking them in the eye." He paused, swallowing emotion, and then came Jada. His voice cracked, but only slightly. "She didn't steal, she didn't lie. She didn't even accept a reward when I offered her one. Instead, she locked my safe, protected my home, and gave me something I thought I'd lost forever: faith. She earned her place, not through manipulation but through grace." He turned to the judge. "I'm of sound mind. Every decision I've made has been deliberate, and giving her leadership of the Winters Foundation was not just a good decision, it was the best one I've ever made." He returned to his seat. Michael didn't speak, he didn't stand. He simply sat there, blinking, unsure of what had just slipped through his fingers. The judge took a recess, then returned 30 minutes later. When the verdict came, the words echoed like a thunderclap in the courtroom. "The court finds no evidence of manipulation, fraud, or incompetence. All claims by the plaintiff, Michael Winters, are dismissed with prejudice. The leadership of the Winters Foundation remains lawfully and rightfully under the direction of Miss Jada Harris. Furthermore, the court orders a formal apology be issued by the plaintiff to the defendants for reputational damage." The courtroom erupted, not in cheers but in stunned, emotional silence. And then applause. Michael stood, red-faced and rigid, and stormed out of the courtroom. But neither Harold nor Jada looked his way. Their eyes were fixed only on each other, exhausted, relieved, but deeply proud. In the days that followed, something changed in the public conversation. Articles once riddled with suspicion now praised Jada's dignity. Donations to the foundation tripled. Letters poured in, not just from beneficiaries, but from strangers who had watched the court footage and were moved beyond words. And in the heart of the Winters estate, behind those tall white columns and winding hallways, the library no longer felt like a mausoleum of memories. Now it was a place of planning, of laughter, of light. Harold and Jada continued to work side by side, as boss and employee, not even just as mentor and protege, but as partners, as family. One evening, as the sun set beyond the trees and painted the sky with gold and lavender, Harold sat on the front porch with a mug of tea. Jada joined him, curling up in the wooden chair beside his, the way she often did after long days. "Do you regret it?" she asked, not looking at him. "Regret what?" he replied, "trusting me." He looked at her for a long moment, his voice steady. "No," he said. "I regret not trusting you sooner." She smiled, eyes misty. "I think Miriam would have liked you," he added quietly. Jada reached for his hand and held it gently. "I hope so." They sat there in silence for a long time, not because they had nothing to say but because sometimes silence was the most honest form of love. And in that moment, Harold knew without a doubt that family wasn't about blood or birthright. It was about trust, about truth, and about finding someone who, even when given every reason to walk away, stays and changes your life forever. Years passed like soft ripples on a still lake, gently bending the edges of memory but never erasing the truth. The Winters estate remained where it had always stood, regal, timeless, its white columns weathering seasons with grace. But inside, the silence was no longer suffocating. Laughter now echoed through its halls, not the loud and careless kind, but the warm, knowing laughter shared between people who had endured life's sharpest blows and somehow remained whole. The old surveillance room was dark now, its screens removed, its cables stripped. Harold had it sealed off years ago, saying he no longer needed to watch the world through walls. Instead, the space had been converted into a reading lounge for visiting scholars, young students funded by the Winters Foundation who came to the mansion to learn, reflect, and grow. Jada Harris was no longer Miss Harris to anyone. She was now addressed as Director Harris, known across the nation for her quiet leadership, her relentless focus on integrity, and her refusal to become a celebrity of philanthropy. She turned down interviews. She rejected book deals. She told every journalist the same thing: the work speaks louder than I ever could. Under her guidance, the network of hope, Harold's dream, had become a living force, not a corporate brand, but a movement. In over 40 states, there were now community centers, medical outreach vans, small business grants, education programs, and mentorship networks that could all trace their roots back to a woman who once chose to lock a safe instead of take from it. Harold Winters, now in his late 60s, had become a quieter presence in the world, but his heart had never been louder. Though his hair had thinned and his steps slowed, he never missed a day sitting beside Jada in the main office of the foundation. He rarely spoke during meetings, preferring to watch the young team Jada had trained, most of them from backgrounds like hers, as they planned, organized, and executed projects that changed lives. Whenever he was asked what his role was, he would smile and say, "I just make the tea." But those who knew him understood that he had become something more powerful than a founder or figurehead. He had become a living reminder that transformation was possible at any age, for any heart. One spring afternoon, as magnolia petals drifted lazily across the garden, Harold sat in his favorite chair in the library, the one Miriam used to sit in, the one he hadn't touched for decades until Jada made it feel warm again. Across from him sat a boy named Evan, no more than 12, who had just received a scholarship from the foundation. He had come from a rough neighborhood in Detroit. His parents had passed within the same year, and for a while he'd bounced between homes, nearly lost to the cracks of a system that didn't always catch the ones who fell. But Jada had read his application herself. She'd flown him to Savannah, introduced him to the mansion, and asked Harold if he'd spend some time with the boy. Sir Evan asked shyly, holding a sketchbook in his lap. "Why did you give her the whole foundation? Weren't you scared?" Harold chuckled softly. He looked out the tall windows to where Jada stood under the peach tree, talking to staff, her notebook in hand, her eyes still sharp. "I was scared," Harold said, his voice slow with age but filled with wisdom, "but not of her. I was scared of losing myself, of living a life where I never trusted anyone again. And then she showed up. And she didn't just ask for a job, she taught me how to believe in people again." Evan nodded slowly. "She's kind. She's more than kind," Harold replied. "She's the reason I didn't disappear." Outside, Jada waved toward the window. Harold raised his hand in return, and though his bones ached and his days were quieter, his soul had never been more alive. In the years that followed, the network of hope grew into something no one could have predicted, not even Harold, who had once ruled boardrooms with confidence. Jada's approach to leadership was unlike any the nonprofit world had seen. She built bridges between the unheard and the powerful, brought communities to the table that had been ignored for decades, and demanded transparency not just from others but from herself. Her speeches were rare, but when she did speak, she spoke from the heart. No prepared statements, no slogans, just truth, and the world listened. Harold watched it all, sometimes from his window, sometimes from the front row. He no longer craved legacy. He had already found it in the woman he once tested and now trusted with his life. Then came a day when the house was a little too quiet. Harold had been ill for weeks, and though he fought with the same silent strength that once carried him through betrayal and heartbreak, his body had grown weary. On a cool autumn morning, with the wind carrying the smell of pine through the garden, Harold called Jada to the library. She entered quietly, sensing something was different. He was seated in Miriam's chair again, a blanket over his lap, a small photograph in his hand, an old picture of Miriam in the sunflower garden, laughing as she held his hand. "Jada," he said softly, "I think it's time." Her throat tightened. "Time for what?" Harold looked up at her, his eyes bright with peace, not fear. "Time for me to go. But I want to go knowing that you're not just running the foundation, you're carrying the soul of it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded slowly, her voice thick with emotion. "You taught me everything. You gave me everything." "No," he whispered, "you gave me back my life." He handed her the photo of Miriam. "She would have loved you, you know." Jada knelt beside him and held his hand. "I love you, Mr. Winters. You're the father I never had. And you," he said, his voice barely a whisper now, "are the daughter I never knew I needed." He closed his eyes, and the room fell silent. But it wasn't the silence of sorrow, it was the silence of peace. Harold Winters passed away that evening, not as a recluse, not as a broken man, but as someone reborn through the honesty of a single soul who had walked into his house and refused to betray his trust a year later. A statue was unveiled in the center of a new urban park built by the foundation in Harold's hometown. It showed a man sitting on a bench beside a young woman holding a book in one hand and a safe key in the other. The plaque read, "To those who lock the vault, but open the heart." Jada stood at the ceremony with her hand over her heart. The world had called her a maid, a thief, a story, but Harold had called her something far more powerful. Family. And in every child she helped, in every dream she funded, in every broken person she gave hope to, she honored the man who dared to trust again. A legacy not written in dollars but in the courage to believe in someone completely.